So today's presentation will be covering the overview portion of the challenge process, including its goals, the phases involved, and the timeline involved for the challenge process. At the end of the presentation, we'll have some time for a question and answer where you can unmute and ask your question. But during the presentation, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A and Susan will try to answer it, or I'll try to answer it after the presentation. So to start off, I want to begin with the end in mind of why we are here today in this webinar. So as many of us probably know, the internet has become increasingly important part of our society. And currently there's around 1 in 10 people in Hawaii that do not have access to high-speed internet. And so we're here to make sure that nobody in our community gets left behind in the digital world because they lack the infrastructure to access a reliable high-speed internet connection. And so that's why the Connect Kako statewide initiative and the BEAD program was developed to accomplish this mission and provide the funding, or BEAD provides the funding to build out internet access for those that do not currently have it. And this is where the challenge process comes in. The challenge process is Hawaii's opportunity to create the most complete map of internet access in the state for BEAD funding. And so what do I mean by that? As many of you folks may be aware, the FCC has a map on internet locations in the state that have or do not have internet access. And so this is the FCC's version and what they think internet is like in the state. And the challenge process is the way that we will be creating our version of the map. So identifying locations that don't have the infrastructure and then having that bid out to someone to then build the infrastructure to these locations. And so the challenge process helps facilitate that and involves 3 phases: a challenge phase, a rebuttal phase, and adjudication phase. Each of these phases will be utilizing a web portal, a map-based web portal, where you can view and submit challenges to the internet status of locations in the state. And each of these phases that we'll be going through are in the current order that you see on the screen. And to provide this portal, this map-based web portal, UH has contracted with a company called Ready.net as our vendor, and they'll be supplying us with this portal that people who are eligible challengers will have access to submit challenges through. And those people are either local government entities, such as counties and state agencies, nonprofits, and internet service providers. So this means that members of the public cannot directly submit challenges to this web portal and will have to work through one of these 3 entities to submit on their behalf for the challenge process. The first phase of the challenge process is the challenge phase. And during this challenge phase, this is where the majority of people will be submitting challenges to Hawaii's version of the FCC map via the challenge portal created by Ready.net. Each challenge that is submitted requires evidence, and each challenge submission that is successfully gone through will then notify the applicable internet service provider with an opportunity to rebut. And this challenge phase will last 30 calendar days. And in this challenge phase, we're challenging specific things. What we're not challenging is adding or removing dots. So if you recall that FCC map that I showed with the green and red dots, what we're not trying to do in this challenge process is add or subtract dots from our map. We're also not trying to correct any of the information in terms of the address, like if the address number is wrong or the classification of the location. What we are focused on correcting through this challenge process is to identify community anchor institutions, or CAIs. Are there any community anchor institutions that lack a 1 gigabit symmetrical speed access? And are there any served, unserved, and underserved locations? And then finally, any enforceable commitments or planned services by ISPs to locations. And so what do I mean if you're unfamiliar with unserved and underserved and CAIs? The requirements for BEAD define unserved as locations that only have access to internet speeds that are less than 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up, or you only can access satellite, internet through satellite at your location. Underserved means that you can get internet, but the speeds, you can only get speeds between 25 and 3 and 120. Or if you only have access to DSL, digital subscriber line, at your location, you are considered underserved. And then finally, with respect to the community anchor institutions, again, CAIs, if you meet the definition, which you can read on our initial proposal, volume 1, if you do not have the infrastructure to support that 1 gigabit symmetrical, then community anchor institutions would qualify for BEAD in that way. So with these definitions in mind, and for locations that kind of meet these criteria, the process involved with challenging will be, first, you'll have the option to select either a single address or select a multitude of addresses in an area. Or if it's an apartment building, you can select that apartment building and challenge the units within that apartment building. Once you've selected the address or addresses that you wanted to challenge on the map-based web portal, you then have to select one of 11 challenge types. And these challenge types are availability, speed, latency, data cap, technology, business service only, a location is a CAI or is not a CAI, planned service, or a location is within an enforceable commitment or not an enforceable commitment. I'll be going over in the next webinar, part 2 of that, going into details of what you need to submit as evidence for each of these challenge types and a more in depth of what these challenge types are. So once you've submitted your challenge type, or you selected your challenge type, you submitted the evidence, the correct evidence for the challenge type, we then move into the rebuttal phase. And this phase involves mainly the internet service providers, the ISPs that have their service challenged. So if a challenge successfully goes through the challenge phase, it'll be in the rebuttal phase where ISPs also need to provide evidence for a rebuttal. ISPs can also sustain the challenge, meaning they agree with what's being given, and therefore the challenge would go through and the outcome will be decided. If a rebuttal isn't provided by an ISP within 30 days, the challenge will be automatically sustained. And this rebuttal phase is 30 days long as well. And the last phase in the challenge process is the adjudication phase, also known as the final determination phase. So once the challenge has been submitted, and if there's any rebuttals that are submitted as well. The University of Hawaii, as the entity that's running this challenge process, will be responsible for reviewing the evidence from both the challenger and the rebuttal to determine what is the final outcome of this challenge. And before that, we're required to post without any personally identifying information what type of evidence was submitted. And we have 30 days to make this final determination. So ultimately, as a challenge goes through the entire process, there are one of two outcomes. The challenge would either be sustained, meaning the evidence for this challenge is correct. It means that what you have submitted is true, and therefore will be looked at by UH to see if it would be part of the set of locations to add for the BEAD funding. The other outcome is a rejection, meaning either a rebuttal was provided that provides counter evidence to the challenge, or some incorrect evidence was submitted, so we couldn't accept that challenge correctly. And so this entire process, from a timeline perspective, we're targeting July of this year as when we would start. The dates are still tentative, pending how the community really feels on the start. We want to make sure that, especially some of the main players involved with the challenge process, which are the counties and ISPs, are really comfortable with the challenge process, then we'll start. But we're looking to start in July, and then it would go into August for the rebuttal phase, and then September for the adjudication phase. So what happens after all of this? So once we go through this entire process as a community, we, UH, will be submitting our results of the challenge process to NTIA. They will review the results, and then upon their approval, then we can begin the subgrantee selection process to bid out for whoever will build out the infrastructure through an RFP process, or request for proposals. So for a timeline perspective, as you can see right now, we're in April, June of this year, and we're currently preparing for the challenge process in July. We're hosting trainings such as this and others to come, especially in the month of June. And then in July through September is the actual challenge process. And then the rest of time will be more administrative things for the BEAD project. I know that was a lot. So to summarize this presentation, the challenge process is Hawaii's opportunity to show what internet access is really like, so that we can determine where to build the internet infrastructure where it's lacking. There are a total of 3 phases in the challenge process, in the order of the challenge phase, a rebuttal phase, and then an adjudication phase. The challenge phase is going to involve ISPs, local government, and nonprofits submitting evidence-based challenges through a web portal to identify these unserved, underserved, and CAI locations. When you do so, you will have to select one of 11 challenge types, and each with different evidence requirements. If a challenge successfully goes through, ISPs will be given an opportunity to provide an evidence-based rebuttal, and then all of this will tentatively begin in July of this year. So next steps that people can take, I would encourage you to look out for more trainings that we're having, both virtual and in person. The bulk of it will be coming in June, so stay tuned and check back frequently to UH's website on the challenge process. Also, very soon, we'll be opening registration for the challenge process. So if you're a nonprofit, an internet service provider, or local government entity, you can begin to pre-register for the challenge process. And then note that during the registration process, you're going to need to provide your employee identification number. So that's your tax EIN number. And then if you're an internet service provider, you have to provide your FCC registration number, your FRN. And then as evidence of your organization, either some sort of documentation, or if you are registered with the Hawaii Department of Consumer Affairs, then yeah, you can submit that information as well. Other next steps that you can take, we highly recommend, if you're not already signed up to the Connect Kako email newsletter, as we'll be pushing out a lot of information such as the training dates, when the challenge process is open and things like that through this newsletter. So I highly recommend you to sign up if you haven't. And then finally, next week at this time, we'll be holding part 2 of this Zoom webinar series. We'll be going into, again, the challenge types and the evidence that's needed.